In modern America, we are familiar with wrongful convictions being overturned before the ultimate price is paid. But in 1950s London, an innocent father was sent to the gallows while the real monster sat quietly in the witness box. No one suspected that this highly respectable neighbor was secretly hiding a graveyard within the walls of their shared home. This is the tragic story of 10 Rillington Place and the fatal mistake that forced an entire nation to abolish the death penalty forever, March 1953. The biting cold of late winter still clung to the smog-choked streets of Notting Hill, a gritty, working-class district of post-war London. At 10 Rillington Place, a dilapidated, multi-occupancy townhouse, characterized by its peeling paint and pervasive dampness, a new tenant named Beresford Brown was busy settling into his ground-floor apartment, eager to make the drab, dimly lit flat feel more habitable for his family. Brown decided to undertake some minor renovations. His immediate goal was to install a small radio, which required running a wire along the kitchen wall to reach a suitable electrical outlet. As he worked his way toward a dark corner of the room, he focused on a peculiar alcove that had been entirely boarded up and heavily covered with thick layers of cheap wallpaper. Assuming it was merely a sealed storage cupboard, Brown began to strip away the paper and pry at the wooden partition. When the first wooden plank gave way, a sudden, heavy wave of putrid air spilled out into the small kitchen. Brown hesitated, then retrieved a flashlight to inspect the hollow space behind the wall. Shining the narrow beam of light through the jagged gap in the wood, he peered into the dusty, suffocating darkness. What his flashlight illuminated in that narrow recess would instantly become one of the most gruesome and paralyzing discoveries in British criminal history. Crammed meticulously into the secret alcove, stacked upon one another in a terrifyingly calculated manner, were the bodies of 3 women, their remains tightly bound and wrapped in old blankets. Struck with absolute horror, Brown stumbled out of the suffocating apartment and frantically alerted the local authorities. Within hours, the quiet gloom of Rillington Place was shattered by the arrival of Scotland Yard. Dozens of detectives and forensic experts descended upon the property, sealing off the street to launch a full-scale, systematic excavation of the ground-floor flat. As officers painstakingly dismantled the kitchen alcove to extract the 3 victims, the grim search inevitably expanded throughout the rest of the neglected apartment. When investigators moved into the front parlor, a distinct, lingering stench of decay prompted them to begin prying up the heavy wooden floorboards. Digging into the shallow, compacted dirt beneath the foundation of the house, they unearthed a 4th victim. Dental records and forensic analysis quickly identified this severely decomposed body as Ethel Christie, the wife of the apartment's previous tenant, a man named John Christie, who had abruptly abandoned the flat and disappeared into the sprawling city just days before Beresford Brown moved in. This horrifying revelation sent immediate shockwaves through the local community, forcing investigators to rapidly reevaluate the true identity of the man who had quietly occupied the ground floor for over a decade. To his neighbors, landlords, and even the local police, John Christie had always appeared to be an exceedingly mild-mannered, quiet, and deeply respectable gentleman. He was an aging veteran of the First World War who had actively served the community as a special constable, a sworn reserve police officer, during the devastating bombings of the Second World War. With his soft-spoken demeanor, neatly parted hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Christie projected an aura of absolute harmlessness and civic authority. He was known locally as a helpful figure who possessed rudimentary medical knowledge, often offering unsolicited remedies and advice to the vulnerable, desperate women living in the impoverished neighborhood. But beneath this carefully constructed, highly respectable facade lay the cold, calculating mind of a prolific serial killer, a relentless predator who had secretly transformed his unassuming ground-floor kitchen into an industrial-scale slaughterhouse right under the noses of Scotland Yard. The sheer volume of victims hidden within the walls, under the floorboards, and scattered across the property was enough to paralyze the public with fear, sparking a frantic nationwide manhunt for the bespectacled former policeman. The discovery of the bodies horrified the nation, but the true nightmare wasn't what the police found in the walls of Rillington Place. It was the chilling realization that just 3 years earlier, the British justice system had already hanged a man for a murder committed in this exact house. To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of the nightmare unearthed in 1953, the timeline must rewind 4 years to the bleak, fog-choked autumn of 1949. At the center of this impending tragedy was 25-year-old Timothy Evans, a Welsh van driver who had recently moved to London seeking a better life. Timothy was a man whose cheerful, eager-to-please demeanor actively masked a profound and dangerous vulnerability. He possessed a significantly low IQ. He struggled immensely with basic literacy, to the point where he could barely read or write his own name. As a result, he navigated the complex adult world with the trusting, easily manipulated naivety of a child. He and his young wife, Beryl, lived a deeply cramped existence in the top-floor flat of 10 Rillington Place. They shared the dilapidated, poorly lit space with their absolute pride and joy, a 13-month-old daughter named Geraldine. By late 1949, the crushing weight of post-war rationing and extreme poverty had pushed the fragile young family completely to the brink of collapse. The tension inside the claustrophobic apartment reached a boiling point when Beryl discovered she was pregnant again. It was a second child that they simply could not afford to feed, clothe, or house. In the draconian legal and social landscape of 1940s Britain, abortion was strictly illegal, fundamentally taboo, and heavily policed. This harsh reality left desperate women entirely dependent on dangerous back-alley procedures that often ended in severe hemorrhage or death. Trapped in a hopeless financial corner, the couple's panicked arguments over money and the unwanted pregnancy frequently bled through the thin, uninsulated floorboards of the London townhouse. These heated disputes echoed straight down the dark stairwell, carrying directly into the eagerly waiting ears of the man living in the ground-floor flat, John Christie, the quiet, bald, and unassuming former Special Reserve police officer had been listening closely to the escalating despair of his upstairs neighbors for weeks. Stepping seamlessly into the role of a benevolent patriarch, Christie approached the distressed couple with a highly calculated lie designed to exploit their exact vulnerabilities. Drawing on his heavily exaggerated history as a medical orderly during the First World War, the older man presented himself to the naive couple as a knowledgeable medical expert. Christie calmly and confidently assured Beryl and Timothy that he possessed the necessary skills to terminate the pregnancy safely. He specifically claimed he had access to a highly effective special gas that would make the underground procedure completely painless. For a legally illiterate man like Timothy, whose cognitive limitations made it virtually impossible to question the absolute authority of an older, highly respected London gentleman. Christie's deadly offer felt like a miraculous, heaven-sent lifeline. The fatal trap officially snapped shut on Tuesday, the 8th of November, 1949. Timothy left for his standard driving route early that morning. He completely trusted his wife to the medical care of the helpful neighbor downstairs. However, he returned hours later to a chilling nightmare that would systematically destroy his entire existence. Upon entering the gloomy, silent tenement, he discovered that Beryl was dead. Before the young, intellectually limited father could even process the agonizing shock or stumble out into the street to summon the authorities, Christie intercepted him in the hallway with a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The predator remained entirely composed, coldly explaining that the illicit termination had resulted in a tragic but unavoidable medical accident. Knowing precisely how to weaponize Timothy's low intelligence and ingrained fear of authority, Christie painted a terrifying picture of the ruthless British justice system. He convinced the trembling Welshman that the police would merely see a dead pregnant woman and would immediately hang the husband for her murder. Paralyzed by profound grief, sheer terror, and entirely dependent on the man he still desperately believed to be a trusted friend, Timothy was easily molded into following the killer's exact script. Christie sternly instructed the panicked husband to pack his bags and leave London immediately. The older man promised to safely dispose of Beryl's body down a local drain, completely out of sight of the prying authorities. Even more crucially, Christie offered to take full custody of 13-month-old Geraldine. He assured Timothy that he had already arranged for the beloved baby to be temporarily fostered by a wealthy, respectable couple in East Acton until the legal heat died down and it was safe to return. Utterly broken, isolated, and lacking the cognitive capacity to see the glaring, fatal holes in this sudden arrangement, Timothy boarded a night train back to his relatives in Wales, leaving everything he loved behind in the shadows of the townhouse. Evans believed he was protecting his daughter by leaving her with Christie. He had no idea he had just handed her to a monster. In late November 1949, the agonizing weight of his fractured reality finally broke the 25-year-old Welshman. Fleeing to his relatives in Wales, Timothy Evans was entirely consumed by a suffocating guilt over his wife's death. He also harbored a desperate, gnawing worry for his 13-month-old daughter, Geraldine. At this point, he still genuinely believed his child was safely in the care of a mysterious couple arranged by John Christie. Unable to bear the psychological torment any longer, Evans walked into a local police station in Merthyr Tydfil. He approached the front desk and delivered a frantic, convoluted confession to the bewildered officers. He claimed he had accidentally killed his wife, Beryl, by giving her a concoction of abortion pills. Furthermore, he stated he had disposed of her body in a drain outside their London apartment. It was a desperate lie constructed to protect the man keeping his baby safe, but it would ultimately seal his own fate. Acting immediately on this disturbing admission, London authorities dispatched a team to thoroughly search the squalid premises of 10 Rillington Place. Investigators pried open the heavy iron manhole cover outside the property. They fully expected to recover Beryl's discarded remains exactly where the young truck driver said they would be. Instead, they found the damp, dark drain completely empty. The search quickly expanded to the rest of the property, eventually leading detectives to the communal backyard. There, they entered a small, dimly lit washhouse cluttered with debris. Hidden behind a stack of discarded firewood and old timber, police uncovered a macabre scene that completely contradicted Evans's initial story. They found the lifeless body of 20-year-old Beryl Evans tightly wrapped in a blanket. Yet, the true horror lay just inches away in a separate, smaller parcel. Inside, investigators discovered the tiny, lifeless body of baby Geraldine. It became immediately apparent that neither had died from a botched medical procedure, as both mother and daughter had been brutally strangled. Evans was promptly transported back to London under heavy guard, completely unaware of the grim discovery waiting for him at the Notting Hill police station. The lead detectives finally confronted the exhausted young man with the blood-chilling reality of the crime scene. They bluntly informed him that his beloved infant daughter was not safely residing with an adoptive family in East Acton, but had instead been found violently strangled in his own backyard. Upon hearing this horrific revelation, Evans was emotionally annihilated. The fragile psychological architecture holding his mind together shattered completely in that stark interview room, reducing him to a sobbing, hysterical mess. Through his uncontrollable grief and profound shock, the terrifying truth finally dawned on the intellectually disabled 25-year-old. He immediately pointed an accusing finger directly at the highly respectable downstairs neighbor. He desperately told the investigators that John Christie was the true monster, insisting the former special constable had orchestrated the entire scheme and slaughtered his family. Unfortunately for Evans, the Metropolitan Police were facing immense public pressure to quickly close this highly publicized double homicide. They had absolutely no intention of investigating a well-spoken, mild-mannered World War I veteran over a poorly educated, stuttering laborer. Instead of rigorously following the blatant evidentiary discrepancies, the detectives pivoted their focus entirely onto Evans. They subjected the profoundly grief-stricken and intellectually limited suspect to a grueling, relentless interrogation that stretched long into the night. Recognizing they were dealing with an incredibly compliant and vulnerable individual, the seasoned interrogators ruthlessly exploited his emotional collapse. Through a catastrophic systemic failure of standard police procedure, the detectives aggressively led the questioning. They subtly fed the deeply traumatized man highly specific, unreleased details about the crime scene that he could not have otherwise known. They provided him with the precise location of the bodies in the washhouse, the method of strangulation, and the specific type of ligature used. Ultimately, they actively molded his confused ramblings into a cohesive, damning narrative that neatly fit their predetermined conclusions, broken, severely sleep-deprived, and wanting nothing more than for the relentless psychological torment to end. Evans finally surrendered to the crushing weight of the coercive interrogation. The detectives presented him with a meticulously typed, legally binding confession that perfectly detailed the brutal strangulation of his own wife and child. They placed a pen in his trembling hand and instructed the weeping father to sign his name at the bottom of the page. In a devastating display of ultimate vulnerability, Timothy Evans put his signature on a document that essentially guaranteed his own execution. It was a complex formal legal statement that, due to his severe illiteracy, he could not even read himself. Evans thought the nightmare had peaked in that interrogation room. But the true horror, the theatre of British justice, was waiting for him at the Old Bailey. In January 1950, beneath the imposing, cold stone arches of the Central Criminal Court, famously known as the Old Bailey, the relentless machinery of British justice prepared to crush a highly vulnerable man. 25-year-old Timothy Evans, a malnourished truck driver whose intellectual capacity hovered around that of a 10-year-old child, was formally charged with the brutal strangulation of his 13-month-old baby daughter, Geraldine. The atmosphere inside the historic courtroom was thick with a grim, predetermined certainty. To the prosecution, the case was merely an administrative formality, a bureaucratic stepping stone before sending a violent deviant to the gallows. They possessed a signed, written confession, a horrific crime scene mapped out by Scotland Yard, and a defendant who seemed thoroughly disoriented by the intricate, formal legal proceedings swirling rapidly around him. But as the trial formally commenced, the neat, tidy narrative the police had so carefully constructed began to fracture under the weight of reality. Standing trembling in the elevated wooden dock, Evans officially retracted the harrowing confessions he had signed under extreme psychological duress and physical exhaustion. With a heavy, stuttering Welsh accent, he desperately tried to articulate the horrific truth that had been entirely ignored during his brutal police interrogations. He repeatedly raised his hand, pointing a shaking finger directly at the chief witness for the prosecution, John Christie. Over and over again, the desperate father told the judge and jury that it was his downstairs neighbor, the man who had promised to provide medical help to his struggling family, who had actually murdered his wife and child. Then, the real monster calmly took the witness box to testify against him. John Reginald Christie presented a chilling masterclass in sociopathic deception, playing the part of the aggrieved, upstanding citizen to absolute perfection, dressed immaculately in a tailored suit and speaking in a soft, polite, almost breathless whisper, which he falsely claimed was the lingering, tragic result of a mustard gas attack during his service in the First World War. Christie commanded the absolute respect of the entire room. He strategically reminded the jury of his time proudly serving his country in the trenches, his respectable, steady employment as a post office clerk, and his previous dedicated service as a special reserve police officer during the terrifying days of the London Blitz. To the eyes of the traditional British legal establishment, this man was the very epitome of middle-class decency, civic virtue, and unquestionable patriotism. The stark, devastating contrast between the two men became the ultimate weapon of the prosecution, turning the courtroom into a tragic theatre of blatant class prejudice. The prosecuting barristers, and even the presiding judge, openly mocked Evans's desperate accusations as the absurd, malicious lies of a cornered animal trying to save his own neck. How could the esteemed jury possibly weigh the disjointed, panicked ramblings of an illiterate, working-class Welshman against the calm, measured, and highly polite testimony of a respectable London gentleman? The institutional bias was deafening, as the court completely dismissed the radical idea that a man with Christie's pristine public record and gentle manners could ever harbour a dark, violent compulsion to kill. They looked right into the eyes of one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in modern British history, and saw only a reliable hero. They had no idea that by dismissing the frantic pleas of a grieving father, they were actively aiding a predator in successfully executing his very own scapegoat. Armed with a toxic cocktail of coerced confessions and overwhelming societal bias, it took the jury a mere 40 minutes of deliberation to seal the young father's fate. They returned to the silent courtroom and delivered a swift, unanimous verdict of guilty. Without a shred of hesitation or doubt, the judge placed the infamous black cap atop his judicial wig and solemnly sentenced Timothy Evans to suffer death by hanging. As the heavy, archaic words of the death sentence echoed across the oak-paneled room, the absolute despair of the moment crystallized into a living nightmare. Here was a terrified, heartbroken father who had lost his beloved wife and his baby girl, standing completely powerless in a room full of educated, powerful men who simply refused to look beyond their own prejudices. He knew exactly who the killer was, yet he was the one condemned to swing from the end of a rope. And perhaps the most chilling, macabre detail of all was the quiet, soft-spoken man sitting comfortably in the public gallery, watching his perfect crime unfold exactly as he had orchestrated. On the bleak, freezing morning of March 9, 1950, inside the unforgiving stone walls of HMP Pentonville, the final act of a catastrophic systemic failure played out with terrifying mechanical precision. The British execution process was renowned worldwide for its grim efficiency, specifically designed to extinguish a human life in a matter of fleeting seconds. As the heavy iron door to the condemned cell swung open, 25-year-old Timothy Evans was greeted by the chief executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, a man who approached his macabre trade with cold, calculated professionalism. Evans, pallid, trembling, and entirely exhausted from months of psychological terror, offered no violent resistance as his arms were swiftly pinioned behind his back with leather straps. Standing on the precipice of eternity, he uttered his final words, maintaining the desperate truth he had screamed since his arrest in Wales. "I didn't do it, Christie done it." A white canvas hood was quickly pulled over his face, silencing his frantic pleas in sudden darkness. The thick hemp noose was tightened securely around his neck, and with a swift, deafening crash, the wooden trapdoor plunged open. The state had legally murdered an innocent father, while the lifeless, broken body of Timothy Evans was unceremoniously buried in an unmarked, lime-filled grave within the prison's desolate courtyard. A deeply disturbing scene was unfolding across the city. John Reginald Christie quietly unlocked the front door of 10 Rillington Place, stepping back into the mundane routine of his supposedly respectable life. The sheer psychological horror of this exact moment cannot be overstated. Christie had not merely escaped justice, he had effectively weaponized the entire British legal system. He had actively manipulated the seasoned detectives of Scotland Yard, the prosecuting barristers, and a High Court judge to legally execute the only living witness to his atrocity. Sitting in the very apartment where he had strangled Beryl Evans, Christie was now an apex predator who had successfully utilized the government as his own personal hitman, clearing the path for his darkest, most violent impulses to reign completely unchecked. Emboldened by his absolute triumph over the law and intoxicated by his own perceived invincibility, Christie's sadistic compulsions rapidly accelerated into a horrifying frenzy. Over the next 3 years, the quiet ground floor flat in Notting Hill was transformed into a localized, clandestine slaughterhouse. The respectable, soft-spoken former police officer lured at least 3 more vulnerable women, Kathleen Riley, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina McLennan, into his home. He once again employed his trusted medical ruse, using a makeshift gassing device to incapacitate them before plunging his hands around their throats. With a mason's meticulous precision, he stripped back the floral wallpaper, pried open the heavy floorboards, and entombed his victims within the very structural foundations of the kitchen and alcove. He slept, ate, and lived completely surrounded by rotting flesh, creating the exact macabre, hidden graveyard that the unsuspecting new tenant, Beresford Brown, would stumble upon with his flashlight in the spring of 1953. But the crumbling walls of Rillington Place could only hold their horrific, decaying secrets for so long. Following Brown's gruesome discovery, a massive nationwide manhunt finally cornered the aging serial killer near Putney Bridge. Stripped of his polite middle-class veneer, a disheveled, financially ruined, and desperate Christie finally confessed to his terrifying catalogue of necrophilic murders. To the absolute horror of the British public and the blinding, undeniable embarrassment of the judiciary, his detailed, nonchalant confessions casually included the strangulation of Beryl Evans, the very crime for which an innocent Welshman had been hanged 3 years prior. The establishment's perfect witness was a monster. In July 1953, Christie was marched to the exact same gallows at HMP Pentonville. In a twist of bitter, poetic justice, the lever to snap his neck was pulled by Albert Pierrepoint, the very same executioner who had bound and hanged Timothy Evans. Christie was finally dead. But the ghost of Timothy Evans was about to rise from his prison grave to haunt the entire British government. When the staggering, macabre details of John Christie's secret graveyard hit the front pages of every major newspaper, the collective realization sent a violent shockwave through the British public. The citizens were not merely horrified by the depravity of a prolific serial killer, but they were deeply sickened by the undeniable complicity of their own judicial system. A relentless, furious campaign for justice immediately ignited across the nation, driven by investigative journalists and outraged legal advocates who fiercely refused to let the ghost of Timothy Evans rest. They meticulously tore apart the original police investigation, exposing the deep, systemic flaws of Scotland Yard that had allowed a monster to walk free. They highlighted the gross negligence of the detectives, the severe psychological coercion inflicted during the interrogation of an intellectually disabled man, and the blinding class prejudice that had entirely corrupted the courtroom proceedings from the very first gavel strike. For over a decade, the political establishment desperately tried to quietly bury its catastrophic mistake, but the public pressure simply refused to dissipate. Finally, bowing to the overwhelming weight of national guilt and international scrutiny, the British government ordered a massive, unprecedented public inquiry in 1965, spearheaded by High Court Judge Sir Daniel Brabham. The ensuing Brabham report served as a brutal official autopsy of the 1950 trial, thoroughly dissecting every coerced statement, every ignored piece of forensic evidence, and every missed opportunity to catch the real killer. While the bureaucratic language of the massive report was highly calculated, its ultimate conclusion was earth-shattering for the legal system. The inquiry formally admitted that it was highly probable Timothy Evans did not murder his infant daughter, effectively destroying the entire legal and moral foundation upon which the state had justified snapping his neck 15 years earlier. Armed with this staggering official admission of systemic failure, the political wheels of redemption slowly began to turn for the disgraced Welshman. In October 1966, Home Secretary Roy Jenkins took the extraordinary and historic step of formally recommending a posthumous royal pardon for Timothy Evans. Queen Elizabeth II officially signed the decree, permanently clearing the young father's name of the horrific, unthinkable crime that had defined his tragic legacy. Following the official pardon, The government authorized the grim, solemn task of exhuming his physical remains from the cold, unmarked, lime-filled grave hidden beneath the harsh concrete of Pentonville Prison. His bones were carefully gathered and finally returned to his grieving family, allowing him to be laid to rest in consecrated ground with the basic human dignity he had been so viciously denied in life. But the ultimate legacy of the horrors at 10 Rillington Place extended far beyond the belated vindication of a single, wrongfully convicted man. The Evans case, standing alongside a few other highly controversial and heavily publicized hangings of the era, completely disgusted the British public and irrevocably shattered their faith in capital punishment. The absolute horror of a civilized government legally executing an innocent, grieving father became the primary, undeniable catalyst for a monumental legislative revolution. Channeling the nation's collective outrage and profound sense of guilt, Parliament pushed through the historic Murder, Abolition of Death Penalty Act in 1965. The centuries-old, blood-soaked tradition of the British gallows was immediately suspended, eventually leading to the complete and permanent abolition of the death penalty across the entire United Kingdom. The modern justice system is a powerful, evolving machine capable of profound course corrections and sweeping systemic reforms. It possesses the vast administrative authority to issue deep public apologies. It can draft monumental new legislation to protect its most vulnerable citizens, and it can bestow prestigious royal pardons to cleanse a wrongfully ruined reputation. But this sprawling legal bureaucracy, no matter how much it attempts to rectify its darkest historical blunders, will always face one devastating, insurmountable limitation. It can bravely change the laws of the land, but it can never reverse the horrifying, absolute finality of a dropping trapdoor. The tragedy of Timothy Evans remains one of the darkest chapters in true crime history, a stark, chilling reminder of the fatal cost of getting it wrong. The justice systems ultimately evolved, but for a terrified and innocent father, that realization came far too late. Do you think the police officers who relentlessly coerced his false confession should have faced criminal charges for their actions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you appreciate deep dives into historical true crime, please leave a thumbs up, subscribe, and consider supporting the channel on Patreon for ad-free episodes. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next case.